The moment Yoon saw her through the sea of tuxedos, his champagne glass remained suspended in midair, forgotten. Beck stood beneath the center chandelier, her silhouette a sharp, defiant strike of crimson in a room filled with predictable wealth. She wasn't supposed to be here. Not at his victory gala. Not after he had discarded her like a flawed line of code following the IPO. "Sir, who is that woman?" his assistant whispered, adjusting his glasses in confusion. "Nobody," Yoon replied, though the lie felt like cold lead in his throat. Just a remnant of the past. But Beck wasn't looking at him. Her eyes were locked onto Jang, the predator of Seoul, whose mere presence at the gala signaled a hostile shift in the city's corporate hierarchy. In the world of the chaebols, Jang was the ultimate kingmaker. A single signature from him could dismantle a legacy overnight. Yoon watched, his breath hitching, as the elite crowd parted like a retreating tide. Jang ignored the politicians and the press, stopping in front of Beck as if she were the only power that mattered in the room. Yoon's stomach dropped. 2 years ago, he had stripped Beck of her credit, her pride, and her rightful place as the architect of his empire, convinced she was a low-born secret he could afford to bury. But as Jang pulled her into a public, possessive embrace, Yoon's mouth fell open in a devastating display of shock. He realized the nobody he had erased was about to become the person who dismantled his throne. The night air atop the Lotte World Tower was biting, smelling of ozone and the cold, sterile promise of a billion-dollar future. While the city lights of Seoul glittered like spilled diamonds below, Beck stood hunched over a tablet, her fingers numb as she ran the final stress test on the AI logistics platform. This was their child, the culmination of 3 years of her sleepless nights and her revolutionary algorithms. She had written 90% of the code in a windowless studio, fueled by ramen and Yoon's promises of a shared kingdom. "It's holding, Yoon," she whispered, her breath blooming in the dark. "The IPO tomorrow, we actually did it." Yoon didn't look at the screen. He stood near the glass railing, his back to her, silhouetted against the horizon in a suit that cost more than her parents made in a year. When he finally turned, his eyes weren't filled with the warmth of a partner, but the cold, clinical distance of a predator. "There's been a change in the filing, Beck," he said, his voice as smooth and sharp as a scalpel. "Your name isn't on the prospectus. I've listed you as a temporary consultant who has already been compensated." Beck felt the world tilt. The tablet slipped from her hands, clattering onto the marble. "Compensated? I built the engine. I built the architecture. Without my logic, this is just a hollow shell." Yoon took a slow, deliberate step toward her, his shadow lengthening across her feet. He reached out, not to comfort her, but to tuck a stray hair behind her ear with a condescending grace. "You're a brilliant technician, Beck. Truly. But look at you." He gestured vaguely at her faded sweater and the exhaustion etched into her face. "Investors don't buy code, they buy a dream. They buy a lineage. You're too common, too lowborn, to stand beside a third-generation heir on the podium. You would tarnish the brand before the opening bell even rings." He pulled a check from his pocket and pressed it into her palm. It was a staggering amount, yet it felt like an insult. "Take this and vanish. You're a ghost in the system now, Beck. Don't make me haunt you." He walked away without looking back, leaving her alone on the rooftop with the wind and the realization that she had built a throne for a man who viewed her as a footstool. She watched him descend in the private elevator, his reflection in the glass already practicing the smile of a self-made titan, never noticing the silent vow forming in the eyes of the woman he had just tried to erase. 6 months after the rooftop betrayal, the neon lights of Gangnam smeared across the wet pavement of a narrow back alley like oil on water. Beck sat on a rusted metal crate outside a windowless research lab, the rain soaking through her thin jacket. She was a ghost in her own city, working for scraps while Yoon's face beamed from every digital billboard in Seoul, celebrating his genius AI breakthrough. The splashing of tires against a deep puddle broke the rhythmic drumming of the rain. A black sedan, sleek and predatory, glided to a halt at the alley's entrance. The back door opened and Jang stepped out. He didn't use an umbrella. He moved through the downpour with the terrifying confidence of a man who owned the weather itself. "It's a waste of a brilliant mind, Beck," Jang said, his voice cutting through the hum of the city. He stopped a few feet from her, his tailored overcoat dark with rain. "Working in a basement while a mediocre heir builds a monument out of your stolen logic." Beck didn't look up. "I signed the papers, Mr. Jang. I took the money. According to the law, I don't exist." "Yoon thinks he's a master of the game, but he's always been too arrogant to read the fine print," Jang countered. He reached into his coat and pulled out a damp, plastic-sleeved document. the original partnership agreement they had signed in the garage 3 years ago. He flipped to the final page, pointing to a string of alphanumeric characters buried in the technical appendix. He saw this as a standard error handling protocol. He was so busy looking for his own name that he didn't realize what you'd actually written. Beck's eyes widened as she recognized the code. It wasn't an error protocol, it was a founder's veto. It was a sleeper cell she had coded into the very foundation of the architecture. A clause that granted the original author total control in the event of a breach of fiduciary trust. Yoon hasn't just marginalized you. He's diverted funds into offshore holdings, a clear violation of this clause, Jang whispered, leaning in closer. You hold the detonator to his entire empire, Beck. You just didn't have the fire to pull the pin. I'm offering you that fire. He held out his hand, a heavy signet ring glinting in the dim light. Partner with me. We won't just take your credit back, we'll take his throne. I'll provide the platform, the legal team, and the red dress. You provide the kill switch. Beck looked at his hand, then at the document that proved she still held the power Yoon thought he had stolen. The rain felt a little less cold. She placed her hand in Jang's, the grip firm and lethal. When do we start? The transition didn't happen in a boardroom, but in a private suite overlooking the neon veins of the city. 4 months, Beck had lived in the gray anonymity of oversized hoodies and a stained lab coat, a uniform of a woman who had been convinced she was invisible. Now, she stood before a triptych of mirrors, watching as the last remnants of that nobody were stripped away by Jang's silent, efficient team of stylists. When she stepped into the gown, the fabric felt less like silk and more like cold, flexible steel. It was a red that didn't just catch the light, it demanded it, a visceral, rebellious crimson that announced a power shift before she even spoke. The dress clung to her silhouette, tracing the lines of a woman who had spent 3 years building an empire in the dark and was finally ready to seize it in the light. You look like a queen ready for an execution, Jang remarked from the doorway, his eyes reflecting the sharp intensity of her transformation. I'm not interested in being a queen, Beck replied, her voice dropping into a low, steady register. I'm the architect. I'm just going to collect what's mine. As she fastened a diamond choker that felt like a localized armor, she looked at her reflection. The exhaustion that had etched itself into her face on that windy rooftop was gone, replaced by a clarity that was terrifyingly sharp. She wasn't the low-born technician Yoon had mocked. She was the only person in Seoul who knew the true structural integrity of his throne, and exactly where the cracks were hidden. The transformation was deeper than the silk. She felt the logic of the founder's veto vibrating in her mind, a digital heartbeat that connected her to every server and every line of code Yoon called his own. She had spent her life hiding her fire to keep him warm, but as she draped a black silk wrap over her shoulders, she knew that tonight she was the one bringing the match. The red transformation was complete. Beck walked toward the door, her heels clicking against the marble with the precision of a ticking clock. She was no longer a ghost in the system or a victim of a corporate lie. She was the woman who owned the future, and she was about to walk into the Shilla ballroom to reclaim it. The golden light of the Shilla ballroom, which had served as Yoon's crown all evening, suddenly felt like the harsh glare of an interrogation lamp. Beck didn't just enter the room, she shifted its entire axis. As she approached the center of the floor, the superior heir felt a primitive chill crawl up his spine, his mouth falling open in a devastating display of public shock that stripped away his decades of practiced poise. Yoon tried to speak, to order the security to remove the commoner, who dared to tarnish his victory, but the words died in his throat. Jang didn't give him the chance to recover. With the calculated precision of a predator, Jang reached out and pulled Beck into a passionate, lingering kiss. It wasn't a gesture of love, it was a public claim of ownership and a declaration of war. Around them, the elite of Seoul stood frozen, champagne glasses arrested mid-air, their eyes wide as they witnessed the social and professional execution of a dynasty. The hum of the ballroom was replaced by the frantic, rhythmic chirping of 100 phones receiving market alerts. Behind the interlocking silhouettes of Beck and Jang, the massive digital stock monitors, meant to track Yoon's triumph, began to hemorrhage red. The founder's veto had been triggered. In the seconds it took for the kiss to break, the algorithm that Beck had birthed in a windowless studio began to systematically lock Yoon out of his own architecture. Yoon's knees buckled. His fists clenched at his sides, his face a contorted mask of emotional shock and public humiliation. On the screens, his net worth wasn't just dipping. It was plummeting, shedding trillions of won as the market realized the genius behind the platform was the woman in the red dress, not the man in the tuxedo. He looked at Beck, expecting to see the low-born girl he had discarded, but he found only the sharp, cold clarity of the new chairperson. The superior billionaire was gone. In his place stood a man who was now merely a spectator to his own ruin, his mouth still agape as the golden chandeliers cast a long dark shadow over the wreckage of his ego. He had tried to erase her from the system, but the system had finally recognized its true creator, and it was deleting him in real time. The digital screens in the ballroom had stopped their frantic descent, settling on a cold, static zero where Yoon's personal wealth used to reside. The silence that followed was heavy, broken only by the sharp, rhythmic breathing of a man who had forgotten how to stand. Yoon looked up, his face a pale ghost of the superior heir he had been an hour ago, but the security team he had personally vetted was already moving toward him. They didn't offer a hand of support. They moved with the clinical precision of men removing a malfunctioning piece of equipment. "This is my gala," Yoon whispered, a final desperate spark of arrogance flickering in his wide eyes. "I am the chairman. You work for me." The lead security officer, a man Yoon had once praised for his unwavering loyalty, didn't even meet his gaze. "The board has been restructured, Mr. Yoon. Your credentials have been revoked. You are trespassing on company property." As they gripped his arms to hoist him from the floor, the crowd, the very elite Yoon had sought to impress, didn't offer a single word of protest. Instead, they raised their phones, capturing the final, pathetic frame of his downfall. The lens flares from their cameras blinded him as he was dragged toward the service exit, his heels scuffing against the marble he had once claimed to own. The superior truth was out. Without Beck's mind, Yoon was just a hollow suit, and the world had no room for a fraud without a fortune. With the doors hissing shut behind the wreck of Yoon's ego, the atmosphere in the room shifted from shock to a strange, respectful quiet. Beck stood at the epicenter of the golden glow, the red silk of her gown reflecting the light like a forge. She didn't look like a woman who had just won a war. She looked like a woman who had finally come home to the empire she had built. Jang stepped to her side, his expression unreadable to the crowd, but his eyes held a rare glint of genuine admiration. He reached for 2 glasses of vintage champagne from a passing tray and handed one to her. "To the new chairperson," Jang murmured, his voice a low vibration that only she could hear. Beck took the glass, her fingers steady as she looked out over the room that had once tried to erase her. She didn't toast to revenge, nor did she toast to the man who had been dragged away. She raised her glass to the logic, the code, and the future that was finally, legally, and irrefutably hers. "To the truth," she replied. As they drank, the golden chandeliers seemed to burn brighter, no longer casting shadows on the past, but illuminating the reign of a woman who had turned a betrayal into a throne. The gala wasn't an end, it was the birth of a new era, forged from the ashes of a billionaire who had mistaken superiority for strength. The end.